What's up, home bartenders? Today we're talking Canadian whiskey. Now, when most people think of Canadian whiskey, they think of two brands. And while there's nothing wrong with those, if that's what you like, great. Those are fine products, but there's so much more to Canadian whiskey. So today we're gonna break it down. All right, let's do it. The Lot 40 Dark Oak, definitely my favorite. So good. All right, before we dive in, a little history on Canadian whiskey. So Canadian whiskey dates back to the early 1800s when Scottish and Irish immigrants came to Canada and brought their distilling traditions with them, but they adapted them to use the available grains such as rye and corn. By the late 19th century, Canadian whiskey had already kind of built its own reputation, but it wasn't until Prohibition that it really gained popularity. So during Prohibition in the United States, where alcohol was illegal, Canadian whiskey became the spirit of choice for many American bootleggers, including the one and only Al Capone. Whiskey had to come from somewhere, and Canada's distilleries were more than happy to provide it. Last quick little fact before we dive into the whiskey is the spelling. Canadian whiskey is spelt with a Y, like Scotch, unlike American whiskey and Irish whiskey, which is spelled with an EY. So this actually dates back to early distilling traditions. So in Scotland, the originators of whiskey, they spelt it with a Y. And then later on, Irish distilleries wanted to distinguish their product, so they stuck an E in there. And then as whiskey expanded throughout the world, different countries, depending on which tradition they followed, used either the EY or the Y spelling. So in Canada, we have the Scottish Y spelling. In the United States, the EY spelling. Although I just recently noticed that Maker's Mark Bourbon actually has a Y, not EY, on their whiskey as a subtle nod to Scotch. So that's kind of interesting. So let's break down the rules of Canadian whiskey. So just like Scotch, just like bourbon, Canadian whiskey has rules, things that you have to do in order to label it Canadian whiskey. But compared to Scotch or bourbon, those rules are pretty relaxed here in Canada. Rule number one, it's gotta be distilled and aged in Canada. Obviously, you wanna call it Canadian whiskey, you gotta make it in Canada. Rule number two, it has to be aged for a minimum of 3 years. Now that's pretty standard in all whiskeys. However, unlike Scotch or bourbon, Canada does not place any restrictions on the type of barrel. So it can be a new barrel, a used barrel, it can be a bourbon barrel, a sherry cask, a wine cask, doesn't matter, as long as it's aged for 3 years. Rule number three, Canadian whiskey can be made from any grain. Now here's where a lot of misconceptions happen. A lot of people think that all Canadian whiskey is rye. That's not true. Now historically, Canadian whiskeys were made heavily with rye grain, which is why somewhere along the line, the term Canadian whiskey and Canadian rye or rye whiskey became interchangeable. And this led to the misconception that all Canadian whiskey is rye, when in reality, Canadian whiskeys are made from a variety of grains, primarily rye and corn, but also wheat and barley. And there's actually no legal restriction to labeling your Canadian whiskey rye, whereas American rye needs to be 51% rye in the mash bill to label it a rye whiskey. Canadian, there's no restriction. Rule number four, pretty standard, it's gotta be at least 40% alcohol by volume. And finally, the last rule, which a lot of people may not like, but the use of additives like caramel and coloring is allowed. But don't worry, the good stuff doesn't use it. All right, let's dive into the different types of Canadian whiskey. All right, first category, traditional Canadian blended whiskey. So this is the classic style of Canadian whiskey, what most people are familiar with: Crown Royal, Canadian Club, J.P. Wiser's. So typically a blend of grains, rye, corn, wheat, barley. As we mentioned before, it might be even labeled rye, but it could be a blend of things because there's no legal restrictions. These whiskeys are typically very smooth, easy drinking, a little fruity, a little spicy, but not overly complex. Which is why I think Canadian whiskey kind of gets a bad rep around the world, because most people are familiar with those products, Crown Royal, Canadian Club, which are just very smooth, easy drinking whiskeys. Great for cocktails, but if you're someone who wants a complex flavor profile, they're not quite getting there. Next, we have our true rye. So these are 100% rye whiskeys. So normally they will label them on the bottle itself as 100% rye or single grain rye to really showcase that this is a true rye whiskey. So I've got here the Lot 40 Dark Oak, which is my personal favorite Canadian whiskey. And then we've got the Dillon's Rye. Dillon's is a local Ontario distillery. They make a huge range of fantastic products, spirits, liqueurs, great stuff. Bitters, lots of bitters. All right. So here you really get, in these ryes, you really get that peppery, spicy note. They're typically a little higher ABV too, so you get a bit of that alcohol bite as well. The Dark Oak, finished in charred casks, just adds a wonderful richness and complexity. That is a fantastic whiskey. The Dillon's Rye, slightly vegetal, bit of dried fruit, but not sweet at all. Oh yeah. I mean, these are some nice, rich, complex whiskeys, miles ahead of like the classic blended Canadian whiskeys. So if you can find these in your local liquor stores, definitely recommend. Next up, we have Canadian corn whiskey. So this is basically Canada's answer to bourbon. So I have here from a local distillery, Last Straw Distillery. This is their corn whiskey. This one's cask strength, so it sits at 64%. They've actually recently released their regular strength. I think it's like 49 or 50%. The regular corn whiskey, but oh yeah, I mean, you'd be hard pressed to be able to pick this out of a lineup against bourbon and see like which one is the Canadian corn whiskey, which one's the bourbon. Obviously, legally speaking, they can't call it bourbon, it's not American, but a lot of these distilleries follow in an attempt to create that bourbon type whiskey. They follow kind of the strict rules of bourbon. So yeah, just rich on the nose, rich vanilla and caramel notes, very sweet. Compared to the rye, this is just pure sweetness. Now, because it's 64%, it's the lingering bite on your tongue is there for quite a while. But oh, such complexity on this one. Off the top of my head, I don't even know if any of the big distilleries here in Canada, like Crown Royal, Canadian Club, make a corn whiskey. They might, okay, so correct me if I'm wrong on that, but you might have to go to local distilleries. I know a lot of local, this is local to me, but I know there's some in British Columbia and all over Canada that make bourbon style corn whiskeys. So I highly recommend finding one. I mean, this might change because of recent events. This might change and some of the big distillers might start making corn whiskeys. But yeah, if you can find one, fantastic product. The next category, unfortunately, I don't have an example of, is Canadian single malts. So just like the corn whiskeys kind of follow a bourbon style, the Canadian single malts follow a Scotch style. So they're made with 100% malted barley, typically made in pot stills and aged in bourbon casks or sherry casks to really follow, and some of them are smoked using peat or whatever we have available here, and to kind of recreate that Scotch-like taste. Some examples of Canadian single malts are Glenbretton from Nova Scotia, Shelter Point from British Columbia, and Two Brewers from the Yukon. The next category is cask finished whiskeys. So just like most whiskeys around the world, Canadian whiskeys are often finished in other barrels to add complexity and different flavors. The only one I have today is my favorite one, the Lot 40 Dark Oak, which is double aged in oak casks. But just like any other whiskey, a lot of Canadian whiskeys can be finished in additional wine barrels, sherry barrel, ice wine barrels. Canada is big on ice wine, so we finish some of our whiskeys in ice wine barrels, and this just adds a layer of complexity to the whiskey. Lastly, we have unique and experimental whiskeys. So whiskeys that go through some unique processes or whatnot. So first on that list, we have White Owl Whiskey. So this one here it is a whiskey. It's not a moonshine because it has been following the rules. It has been aged 3 years in barrels, but afterwards they pass it through a charcoal filter to remove the color. Now, doing so does remove a lot of the standard whiskey quality. So if you're tasting this for the first time, you might go like, oh my God, that's not whiskey. It is, technically. So yeah, it's not something I would just typically sip on. However, I think of this whiskey as like, it's a whiskey that drinks like a gin. It's very gin-like in its quality, in its drinkability. It doesn't taste like gin because it doesn't have, the gin-like flavors, but imagine a gin that doesn't have the juniper, doesn't have the citrus, instead has those woody rye grain qualities of Canadian whiskey. I believe it is a 100% rye. I honestly don't know, but it has a grain mash bill typical to Canadian whiskey. And then, like I said, they just filter out the color. I've made a martini with this, just 2 ounces of this, 1 ounce of vermouth, and it makes a fantastic martini that just instead of gin flavor, it's a subtle whiskey flavor, and it's so good. This is a Irish style poitín moonshine, Irish style moonshine from a local distillery. They used to be called OM Distillery. They're now called SFR Distillery here in Ottawa. And this is an Irish style moonshine. So moonshine is basically a precursor to whiskey. It is unaged whiskey. So it's a neutral grain spirit that is just unaged, so before they turn it into whiskey. So technically not Canadian whiskey because it's still in its moonshine phase, but fantastic flavor. It's pot still, Irish style, is really potent, not for the novice drinker for sure, but remarkable flavor. And SFR Distillery has been aging this for 3 years in order to make it into a Canadian whiskey, which would make it, I assume, a Irish style Canadian whiskey. I have yet to get a bottle. I'm gonna get a bottle. I'm gonna review it, but I haven't done that yet. So, but yeah, great. So this one is a moonshine because it's unaged. This one, even though it's clear, not a moonshine, it is a whiskey that has been aged and then simply the color filtered out. So there is a distinction there. Well, I hope that's educated some of you in Canadian whiskey. Those who thought that Canadian whiskey was just Crown Royal, Canadian Club, I hope that kind of dispels some of the misconceptions. And to my fellow Canadians out there, go looking for some quality whiskeys out there. There's a lot of quality whiskeys, a lot of local stuff, small distilleries that I've probably never heard of throughout our great country. I'm sure there's lots of them. Go find them, go grab a whiskey. Now let's make a few classic Canadian cocktails. Let's do it. All right, our first Canadian cocktail, probably one of the most famous ones, is the Toronto. Starting with 2 ounces of a Canadian rye whiskey. I'm using here the Dillon's 100% rye. So 2 ounces of rye into our mixing glass. After that, we're gonna want a 1/4 ounce of a Fernet Branca. So if you have any Fernet Amaro, obviously Fernet Branca is the most known one. This is going to give us some sweetness and some bitterness and some nice kind of minty complexity. It's great. After that, another classic Canadian flavor, we're going to want a 1/4 ounce of maple syrup. The real stuff, the good stuff.
Don't use anything crap. Use the real maple syrup. And finally, we want 2 dashes of Angostura bitters. This is a stirred drink, so get your ice in there, get your spoon, and give it a good crazy stir until it's nicely chilled and diluted. We're going to serve it in a Nick and Nora and garnish with a cherry.
The Toronto cocktail. This is a famous one. Cheers. That's so good. I hate these sticks. Let me just stick that cherry in there. There we go. Rich rye up front, sweetness, subtle maple hit. We only put a 1/4 ounce of maple syrup, but it lingers on the finish. You do get that maple flavor. And then the Fernet adds this kind of minty quality. That does linger, but it's afterwards. You know, you see rye up front, little minty Fernet Amaro flavor, and then maple sweetness that lingers. Really nice cocktail. Some people make this with just simple syrup. I definitely recommend making it with maple syrup. It really makes a difference. That is a great cocktail. Wow. Hey guys, I hope you've been enjoying this Canadian whiskey breakdown so far. We went through all the Canadian whiskeys and the different categories. Now we're into cocktails. We've made the Toronto cocktail. If you like what you're seeing, guys, please hit that subscribe button, hit that little bell so you get notified when we release new content. We got 2 more cocktails to make for you. Cheers.
Next up, we have the Montreal cocktail. A lot of these Canadian cocktails are just named after famous Canadian cities. It's kind of weird. This is an equal parts cocktail, so starting with our Canadian Rye Whisky, we're doing 3/4 ounce of Canadian whiskey. I'm using here the Wiser's blended special blend, but any Canadian whiskey will work. After that, we want 3/4 ounce of a gin. I'm using a Canadian gin from Dillon's Distillery, but obviously any dry gin you got will work. After that, we want an Aperol or any kind of similar style aperitif, but a sweeter one, not Campari. You want something fairly sweet because this is the only sugar that this cocktail is getting is from this particular liqueur. So 3/4 ounce of Aperol, and after that 3/4 ounce of a gentian liqueur. I'm using my homemade gentian liqueur. If you have Sue's or Sailor's, use that. If you want to check out my recipe for my homemade gentian, make sure to check out that link right there. 3/4 ounce of that, so it's equal parts of our 4 ingredients. Okay, let's give it some ice, and this one here is a shaken drink, so get your tin on there, and we're gonna give it a good crazy shake. We're then gonna serve this up in a Nick and Nora, double strain to get rid of any ice chips, garnish with a lemon peel.
The Montreal cocktail. So the Canadian rye on this one is definitely less present. I used a blended. Maybe if I used 100% rye, I taste it a little more, but obviously it's all equal parts, and it's competing with the gin. We used a Canadian gin from Dillon's Distillery. You definitely pick up the rye, you get those peppery notes, and then you get a little sweetness. This is not a sweet cocktail, but you get a little sweetness from the Aperol. That's why you want to use Aperol. I was tempted to use, because I wanted to use all Canadian products, and I was tempted to use a blood orange aperitif, but that one's closer to Campari. You definitely don't want Campari in this one because that Aperol is the only sweetness in this cocktail. Everything else is either bitter or just alcohol strong. So the Aperol is the only sweetness in there. So yeah, so if you have a comparable Canadian Aperol product, then use that. But for me, I just had Aperol, so that's where it's at. Yeah, so you get kind of a blend of the rye or the whiskey and the gin up front, botanicals of the gin and the peppery notes from the rye, and then the sweetness of the Aperol, and then lingering is that gentian. I use my homemade gentian liqueur. Check out that recipe if you want. But if you're using Sue's or Sailor's or whatever you have, gentian note just carries on the end. It's very nice. I like this quite a bit. Yeah, not overly sweet, but very easy drinking regardless. Not overly bitter. Gentian is bitter, but it does have a flavor that doesn't kind of feel too bitter, even though it is hard to explain, but it kind of carries it at the end. Yeah, this is a great one.
Lastly, I wanted to make the one I mentioned earlier, the Canadian Whiskey Martini. So basically a classic gin martini, but instead of gin, we're using the White Owl whiskey. That's the charcoal filtered clear rye whiskey. So 2 ounces of our White Owl. We then want an ounce of a dry vermouth. This is a local Canadian dry vermouth from Taw's Winery and has a wonderful cinnamon flavor, which works really well in this particular martini. Finally, a couple dashes of orange bitters, and instead of the classic Ango, I'm going to go with a Canadian bitters from Dillon's Distillery. I use a lot of Dillon's products today. We wanted to keep this one entirely Canadian. All right, so stir, 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 serve up in a martini glass and garnish with a lemon peel.
All right, I just had to make this for you guys because I think this is such a fun, unique cocktail, the Canadian Whiskey Martini using the White Owl whiskey, which is a clear whiskey. Cheers. It's really remarkable. Yeah, it has such a, it tastes like you drink it, you think you're drinking just a regular martini, but then you know, you're like, well, where's the juniper? Where's the pine? And instead you get a wonderful rye, peppery, woody flavor. And it's really unique. If you can get Taw's Winery's vermouth, this vermouth is amazing. It has a really pronounced cinnamon flavor, which follows through to whatever cocktail you're putting it in. And I think it just works. I've tried it in a regular martini with gin. I've done it several times in a whiskey martini with the White Owl whiskey, and it just works. And then the addition of the Dillon's orange bitters, these are all Canadian products. It's great. There's a Canadian whiskey martini with clear Canadian whiskey, Canadian dry vermouth, and Canadian orange bitters. Oh, Canada. Anyways, but yeah, definitely give this a try. If you haven't tried this, holy crap, this is good. And please don't put olives in here. I don't know, maybe it works. Maybe you like, I don't think saltiness works in this, but if you want to give it a try, go for it. But I just, the zest of the lemon twist is just really brings this together. Oh, that's so nice. Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Canadian whiskey, Canadian cocktails, and other Canadian products. This has been a lot of fun. I hope your takeaway from this is that Canadian whiskey is so much more than just Crown Royal and Canadian Club. And yeah, I'm not trying to crap on those products. They're great products, but there is a lot more diversity. There's a lot more styles of Canadian whiskey, and you really should give them all a try. From the blended Canadian whiskeys to the hardcore 100% true ryes to the corn whiskeys that mimic bourbon flavor. There's so much to choose from. It's a great whiskey. Make sure you check out the big distillers. Make great stuff. Lot 40, pretty much available everywhere, but then also the small distillers. Wherever you are in Canada, check out your local distilleries. They make great products, all right? If you want to see a playlist of all my Canadian-centric videos, check out this playlist right here. Otherwise, if you want to see a video of all my maple syrup cocktails, check out this playlist right here. Otherwise, guys, we will see you in the next video. Cheers.